The collector's tally rod was already glowing against my mother's counter when I realized the human was standing in our line. Gath of the Tithe had his thumbspur pressed into our ration ledger, reading off a debt we did not owe, and 3 customers had already slipped out the back of the stall rather than witness it. Only the human stayed. She stood fourth in a line that no longer existed, holding her empty broth tin, waiting to be served as if the largest Korush on Deck 9 were not currently explaining to my mother what happened to stalls that missed a tithe. I should say for the record what I was then. Essex Tarn of the Vreneth 16th Turning refugee tag still stitched to my collar. My mother Saya ran a broth stall in Spindle Row, the cheap arc of Berest Ring, where the hegemony put the people it did not want to look at. My little sister Miru slept in the back of the stall between 2 crates of dried weed stock. My father stayed behind on the scald when it burned. That was the whole of us. We were by any measure the tithe used, the weakest family on the station, and the tithe measured everything. Gaith finished his recitation. 11% of gross payable in scrip or stock, late fee compounding. My mother's gill frills had gone flat against her neck, which among Vreneth means surrender, and Gathy knew it, because the tithe employed collectors from 9 species and trained them to read all 9 kinds of yielding. That was when the human reached past his arm and set her tin on the counter. 1 broth, she said. Extra root if you've got it. I want to describe the silence correctly, because everything that came later was already inside it. Gath was plated, brow to dorsal ridge, 300 kilos of professional intimidation, and he turned the way big things turn, slowly, granting her time to recalculate. She did not recalculate. She counted scrip out of a worn yard canvas a pouch, coin by coin, while my mother's hand shook filling the tin. Stall's closed, Gathy said. Doesn't smell closed, the human said. She was old. I knew that much about humans, that the creases meant age and the gray meant more of it. 60 turnings, I learned later, 61. A widow named Marinosi who lived alone in a hab cube at the end of our row with grow lights in the window and tomato vines behind the glass. She'd been on Berest Ring 2 years, and I had never heard her say more than 4 words together. She took her broth, nodded to my mother the way you nod to someone over a fence, and left a coin extra on the counter. Gath let her go. That is the detail the assessors kept returning to. Years afterward, when they interviewed me with their recorders running. He let her go. And none of us understood yet that the most dangerous moment in the history of the tithe on Berest Ring had just walked out of a broth, stall carrying extra root. The tithe came back 2 days later because of course they did. Spindle Row was their ledger, and a ledger with 1 unpaid line infects the whole column. This time it was Gathy and 2 tallymen, and they did not come for the 11%. They came for me. They called it apprenticeship. That was the tithe's word for it, written into their articles like something a guild would offer. A strong-backed Vreneth youth, debts forgiven against a term of service, runner work at first, then cargo, then whatever the cargo turned into when the lights were off. Every family on the row knew a son or a daughter who had been apprenticed. You saw them afterward at the dock gates with new boots and old eyes, and their mothers stopped coming to the communal table. Gaith put the contract slate on our counter and put his spur through the corner of it, pinning it, and looked at my mother. The boy works 1 term, he said. The ledger clears, everyone profits. My mother's frills went flat again. I felt my own start to drop. 16 turnings old, and I was already learning the posture, the species-wide arithmetic of the small. Comply, survive, comply again. I reached for the stylus. A hand closed over the slate. I had not heard her come in. That unsettled me then and unsettles me now. Korish have seismic pads in their feet, and even they never heard Marinosi walk anywhere. She had her empty tin in one hand. The other lay flat on the contract, brown and seamed, 2 fingers crooked from old breaks that had healed the way human bones apparently heal, which is to say stubbornly and without permission. He's spoken for, she said. Gath's breath vents cycled once. Says who? Says me. He starts at my bench in the morning. Pressure seam work. I've already filed the apprenticeship with the deck registrar. She slid the slate out from under his spur, the way you'd take a plate from a child, and set it gently back against his chest. He's mine. I had never heard the phrase before, not the way she used it. Vreneth have ownership words for tools and kin words for blood, and nothing in between. She said it without raising her voice and without looking at me at all, and Gaithy stood there doing the math the tithe had trained him to do, threat against yield, cost against column, and somewhere in that math a number failed to resolve. You're interfering with a tithe instrument, he said. I'm ordering broth, she said, extra root. My mother filled the tin. Her hands, I noticed, had stopped shaking, which frightened me more than anything Gaithy had done, because it meant she believed something I did not yet understand was there to believe in. Goth took the contract and left, and his tallymen followed him, and that evening a man named Dolan Vey, who ran the tithes operations across 3 decks of Barris Ring from an office at the cargo dock, opened a file on the human Marin O.C., widow, retired, no affiliations, no record, no leverage noted. I know the file existed because I have since read it. It is 4 lines long. The last line, added by an analyst whose name is redacted, says low priority, elderly female, no threat indicators. The Hegemony's Office of Species Advisories now uses that line in its training materials. They show it to junior assessors on the first day, before anything else, the way you would show someone a hull breach and say, this is what a 0.5 millimeter flaw becomes. Because every catastrophe the tithe suffered in the following 100 days was already present, complete, in the moment an old human woman put her hand on a slate and said 2 words in a broth stall, and not one of them, not the collector, not the analyst, not the boss at the dock, knew enough about humans to be afraid. I went to her bench the next morning because I did not know what else to do. Half the row had heard by then. Old Hennick, who repaired air scrubbers 2 cubes down, walked me to her door himself. And I remember he kept patting on my shoulder the way you pat someone boarding a ship you are not sure comes back. She opened the door before I knocked. Inside, the cube smelled like soil and hot metal. There was a workbench down one wall, a rack of breaker's tools worn to the shine, the tomato vines under their violet lights, and a picture of a human man in a tug pilot's jacket fixed to the wall at eye height, the way you mount something you intend to look at every day. You'll want gloves, she said. Your hands are wrong for the seamer. We'll fix that. That was the entire conversation about the tithe. She never mentioned them that morning or any morning. She put a pressure seamer in my hands, corrected my grip twice without comment, and set me to running practice beads down scrap plate until the line came out clean. When I ruined the first 6, she looked at the 7th and said, better, and I felt the word land somewhere in my chest with a weight completely out of proportion to its size. I learned 3 things about her in the first span of days, the way you learn things about humans sideways and too late. First, she had spent 34 years breaking decommissioned warships at the Endesa yards, foreman for 20 of them, which meant she had spent more of her life inside the load-bearing bones of armed vessels than most naval architects. When she looked at a wall, she was not seeing the wall. She was seeing what held it up, what ran behind it, and what it would take to bring it down. Second, her husband Don had flown atmosphere tugs until the fiber rot from the yards reached his lungs, and she had nursed him for the last 3 years of it in this cube. And when he died, she had stayed 2 doors from a broth stall on the cheapest arc of a dying ring, for reasons no one on the row had ever had the courage to ask. Third, and I did not understand this one until it was over, she had been watching the tithe for 2 years, not fearing them, watching them. The way a foreman watches a load stack that has been racked wrong, with a patience that is not passivity at all, but a schedule that has simply not yet come due. The tithe's first answer came on the 8th day, and it came the way the tithe preferred, deniable and aimed at the soft parts. Our water allotment failed. Not cut, which would have left a record, but degraded. The flow regulator on our junction recalibrated until the stall's line dribbled gray and the broth pot stood empty through the morning rush. The deck maintenance office told my mother there was a queue. The queue, everyone understood, was the message. Marin came by at the close of that first dry day, looked at the dead tap for a moment, and went home. She returned with a tool roll and a registrar's inspection tag she had apparently held current since her yard days, because breaker foreman, she explained later to the assessor, learn early to keep every certification alive, since you never know which door a piece of paper opens. She had the access panel off in 4 minutes. She did not fix our regulator. She removed it, photographed its tampered calibration screw under a hand lamp, logged the image with the deck registrar under her inspection tag, and installed a new regulator from her own stores. Then she walked 6 junctions up the line to the flow shed that fed the tithe's dockside properties, and she inspected that too. Her tag gave her the right. She found, as anyone would find in a syndicate-run shed, 11 code violations, and she logged everyone, dry as dust. No accusations, just serial numbers and clauses. Within a day, the maintenance office, terrified of an audit trail it could no longer delete, restored our water and put the tithe's shed on a compliance schedule that cost Dolan Vey more in a month than our stall's tithe brought him in a year. That was the first time I watched the row's opinion of her shift. Hennick said it at the communal table, quietly, frills half raised. She didn't fight them. She filed them. The second answer was less polite. 2 collectors came to her door at the start of 3rd shift when the corridor cameras on our arc happened to be down for scheduled maintenance, which is the kind of coincidence the tithe could buy by the hour. I watched from our stall, because by then I watched her door the way you watch weather. The collectors were Korish, both of them, and they did the thing Korish do, which works on every species in the row because it is engineered to. They stood too close. Drop their voices into the seismic register you feel in your spine, and let their bulk make the argument. Marin was potting tomato seedlings on her step. She had a tray of them, little green threads in cups of soil, and she went on potting them through the entire display. Not one tremor in her hands. I have since read the xenobehavioral literature on this, the papers with titles like Anomalous Threat Response in Bonded Humans, and I can report that the literature is accurate. Her heart rate, had anyone measured it, would have been dropping. The larger collector said something I could not hear. Marin answered without looking up, and I heard her, because she did not lower her voice. She had, I came to learn, exactly one register, the flat-carrying tone of a woman who spent 3 decades being audible over plasma saws. "You're standing in my light," she said. They stood a moment longer, recalculating the way Gathy had recalculated. Chorish threat display has a rhythm to it, an escalation ladder with rungs every species on the row knows by feel, and the entire ladder depends on the other party climbing it with you, yielding or resisting, but responding. She gave them nothing to respond to. She watered the seedlings. One of the collectors finally took a half step back, which Korosh do not do, and I watched his plates flex with something the literature would call dissonance distress, and the row would call getting spooked. And they left, and the report they filed that night survives in the seized records. I have read that too. It says subject non-compliant. It says standard escalation ineffective. And then it says the sentence that Counselor Vesh would later read aloud to Dolan Vey with what I am told was visible professional alarm. Subject does not appear to understand the situation. She understood the situation. That is the point of everything I am setting down here. Of every party on Barest Ring, the collectors, the boss, the registrar, the row, my own family, the human was the only one who understood the situation completely, because she was the only one who knew what was already in motion. The bench work continued through all of it. That is what I remember most from those weeks. Not the menace, but the seams. She taught the way I imagine she ran her yard crews. Few words, no praise that wasn't earned, total attention. When my line wandered, she did not say it wandered. She asked me what my feet were doing, and she was always right. The fault was always somewhere upstream of the hands. Miru started coming with me, 6 turnings old, and Marin put her on sorting fasteners by thread pitch and paid her in tomatoes, and my sister, who had not spoken much since the scald, began narrating the entire fastener economy of her sorting tray to anyone who would listen. My mother sent dinner pots to Marin's cube twice a week. Marin sent back the pots heavy. Tools she said she had spares of vine fruit. A cold weather liner for Miru, cut down from a yard jacket with seam work so fine I recognized it as a lesson aimed at me. The row watched all this the way you watch something you have no word for. Vreneth have kin and not kin. The Korish have clan debt. The Lalim have contracts. Nobody on Spindle Row had a category for what the human was doing, which was, although none of us could have said it then, the oldest human behavior in their species file. She was adopting us. Quietly, without ceremony, one repaired scrubber and one welding lesson at a time, an old woman with no family was building one out of whatever the hegemony had swept into her corridor. The tithe could not see it either. That is not an insult to the tithe. Their instruments were good, their analysts competent by every standard the galaxy had. They priced threats the way everyone prices threats, by capability and by stake. An elderly widow's capability was filed as negligible, and her stake in a Vreneth broth stall, by any rational measure, by blood, by contract, by clan debt, by profit, was 0. Their model had no field for the truth, which is that by midwinter the stake was total, and the capability was 3 decades of knowing exactly how large structures come apart. Gath came back to the stall once more in that period, alone, without his rod. Looking back, I believe it was the closest the tithe came to averting what was coming, and I believe Gathy half knew it, because collectors stand nearest the ground and feel tremors the office never logs. He bought a broth, paid full scrip, and stood drinking it while my mother pointedly served the customers behind him. "The yard woman," he said to me quietly, "she kin to you?" I said the honest thing, because I was 16 and had not learned yet which truths feed which fires. "No," I said. "She's just our neighbor." Gathy looked at me for a long moment with those flat amber eyes, and then he said the only intelligent sentence anyone in the tithe produced in the entire affair, and the seized records show he never put it in a single report. "Then why," he said, "does she look at this stall the way my mother looked at the clan hold?" He left without waiting for an answer. He requested a transfer off Barest Ring 9 days later. It was denied. Dolanvey's office logged the request under personnel, retention, no action, which means that the one professional on the tithe's entire deck roster who correctly identified the threat was the one they ignored, and the analysts who called her low priority were the ones they believed. The Office of Species Advisories has a name for this failure now. They call it the visibility gap, the period during which a human has bonded and the surrounding parties have not yet detected it, because human bonding produces no signature any standard instrument reads, no declaration, no ritual, no registered relationship. The file just says neighbor. The office's training materials state, in the careful language of an agency that has rebuilt this exact catastrophe from 41 separate incident reports across 30 years, that the visibility gap is the most dangerous interval in any engagement involving humans, because it is the interval in which you are still pricing the human as an individual. By midwinter on Brest Ring, the gap had been open for 60 days and the tithe was about to close it the worst way there is. The squeeze came before the grab did, because the tithe's manual and the seized records show there genuinely was a manual, prescribed isolation before force. Cut the target out of the herd first. It is sound doctrine for every herd in the spur, and the tithe ran it competently, and watching it fail is the part of those weeks the office's behavioral annex dwells on longest, because it failed for reasons no one in the dock office could see on any instrument they owned. First, the Fab Shop quota board found that the Tarn family's print allotment had been reassigned pending review. Then the cold storage co-op discovered an irregularity in our membership, pending review. Then, the carriers whose job produce up from the agridex began, one by one, apologetically, to be too full to take my mother's standing order, and the broth went thin, and everyone on the row understood the grammar of it, because the row had watched this sentence being written about other families for 40 years. You were not attacked. You were subtracted. Doors did not slam. They simply failed to open, until the family at the center of the silence packed a crate one night and went downring, and the stall changed hands, and the row breathed out and resumed, pretending the weather was natural. Marin watched the subtraction begin with the expression she used on a bad weld, and then she did something that the row talks about to this day, and it was not dramatic, and the tithe surveillance summary for that week does not even flag it, which the office's annotators marked, years later, with a kind of scholarly despair. Subject relocated her work activities. Threat relevance, none assessed. She moved her bench into the corridor. Her cube fronted the row's main walk, and she had the registrar's leave for a work frontage. Filed, of course, stamped, of course. And one morning the bench was simply out in the open with the seamer rack beside it, and me at the second stool, and the entire daily traffic of Spindle Row flowing past 2 meters away. She had taken the one thing the tithe wanted invisible, her connection to us, and made it the most public fixture on the deck. Every shift, whoever walked the row saw the human teaching the Vreneth boy, saw Miru's fastener tray, saw my mother's dinner pot arrive and her tool gifts go back. The subtraction arithmetic ran on deniability. On 100 small private refusals, nobody had to own in daylight, and she had quietly arranged for there to be no more private. The co-op reinstated us in 6 days. Its quartermaster, Old Sen, stopped at the bench to say the irregularity had resolved and could not meet my eyes, and Marin said, "Glad to hear it. Your manifold's whistling. Bring it by." And that was the whole reprisal. The entire vengeance of the human upon a being who had helped starve her family. She fixed his manifold, and he sat at the communal table that night with the look of a man who had been forgiven in a currency he did not know how to carry. The annotators have a heading for this section of the reconstruction. They call it counter-isolation, and the summary line reads, "The subject did not defend against the severing of social ties. She generated new ties faster than they could be severed, including with participants in the campaign itself, and the campaign dissolved because its instruments kept defecting to the target. The tithe could buy silence and rent fear, but it had no product that competed with a fixed manifold and a flat voice saying bring it by, and it took the dock office 5 weeks to even perceive that it was losing, because nothing it knew how to measure was moving. It was during the corridor bench weeks that she gave me the lesson I did not recognize as the spine of everything until the proceedings forced me to. We were walking back from the salvage exchange with a spool of seam wire, the long way, because she always took the long way, and I had assumed for months that this was an old woman's pace and nothing else. Outside the Tide's dockside holding office, she stopped to rest, leaned on the rail, and said conversationally, "Tell me what's holding that building up." I said, "Walls like a boy." She waited. I looked again and started seeing it the way the bench had been teaching me to see, and said the transverse frames probably tied to the deck ribs, and she said, "Which rib's doing the work?" And we stood there 4 minutes while she walked me, load by load, through a structure I had been afraid of. My whole life, the pressure door rated wrong for its frame, the conduit cluster that meant the power room sat against the north wall, the patched plating that told you where they had cut corners and would cut them again, and at the end of it, the tithe's office was not a fortress anymore, and never was again. It was a stack of decisions, most of them lazy, and she straightened off the rail and picked up the wire and said, "Everything's holding its breath, Essex. Buildings, ledgers, men. Your job is to know where before you're standing under it." I asked her, because the corridor was empty and I was 16 and full of the question whether she was scared of them at all. She thought about it honestly. She did me that courtesy always. "I buried a husband by centimeters for 3 years," she said. "Watched the rot, take him a scan at a time, and couldn't file a single form against it." She shifted the spool on her shoulder. "These people put their fear in writing and serve it at counters. Everything they do has a load path." "No," she said, and started walking. "I'm not scared of anything with a load path." The tide's next instrument was rates. If the row would not isolate the family, the row could pay for its sentiment, and the quarter's tithe assessment went up 4% deck-wide, with a notice that cited rising security costs, which was Dolanvey making the lesson legible. The human's defiance had a price, and everyone else's name was on the invoice. The manual calls this socialized consequence and rates it highly effective. The annotator's margin note beside that rating consists of the incident report number of what followed and the single phrase, "effective against herds," because the row did the thing the manual said herds do not do. It got angry in the wrong direction. 40 years of assessments had taught Spindle Row to absorb increases the way Hull absorbs micrometeorites, and the manual priced on that history, but the history had been written before there was a corridor bench, before Sen's manifold, before 40 families had watched the Tarnstall refuse to be subtracted and survive the refusing. The increase needed the old arithmetic, comply and survive, and the old arithmetic needed everyone to believe that compliance was the only roof on the row, and the corridor bench sat there every shift, 2 meters from foot traffic being a different roof. Henneck refused first. Politely, fatally, in writing, citing, and he showed me the draft with his frills trembling and his jaw set, the pending compliance review of the tithes flowshed as grounds to escrow his assessment until the syndicate's own accounts were certified. Escrow. A scrubber repairman on a refugee deck, demanding the extortionist post audited books. He had not invented that instrument. It had been mentioned at the communal table, once mildly, by a retired forewoman spooning broth, in the way I now understand she mentioned everything, which was the way a breaker leaves a pry bar where the next shift will find it. 11 stalls escrowed in the first span, 30 by the end of the next. The script still flowed into a register-sealed account the tithe could see and not touch, the entire revenue of Deck 9 accumulating with perfect legality just beyond the dock office's reach, and there was nothing to raid and no one to make an example of because the row had not refused to pay, Your Honor. The row was merely waiting, paperwork pending, for its counterparty to certify its books. And the counterparty's books could certify nothing, because the counterparty's books were the confession. Gaithie's collection routes returned 40% that month. His report, the one the proceedings read into the record while I watched Chorish officers of the court sit very still, ends with the request for transfer, denied, and above it a paragraph his superiors marked as speculative and unsuited to a collection summary, and which the Office of Species Advisories has since reproduced in its curriculum without changing a word. The deck has stopped being afraid in the correct way. I cannot collect against what has replaced it. We keep treating the human as one resident among 4,000. I have walked the road daily for 6 years, and I am telling you she is not one resident. She is a load-bearing member. The deck has tested its weight on her, and she held, and 4,000 beings have adjusted their stance accordingly. The way cargo settles against whatever holds. Request guidance on collecting from a population that has found something to stand on. There was no guidance. There was, 11 hours after the corridor incident that came at the end of those weeks, a consultant. They took their grab at me in the service corridor behind the fab shops on a 4th shift run when I was hauling scrap plate back to Marin's bench. I am not going to dramatize it, partly because I was face down on the deck for most of the relevant interval, and partly because the corridor cameras caught the whole thing, and the footage was played, frame by frame, in 3 separate proceedings afterward. So the record does not need my adrenaline. What the footage shows is this. 2 Chorish, Brell, and Akitsu, both on the tides enforcement roster, step out of a maintenance alcove and put me down with the standard 2-point restraint they had used on apprenticed youths 100 times. A conscription in everything but the paperwork. The plan, the seized communication show, was a holding room at the cargo dock, a re-signed contract, and a lesson to the row about what filing complaints buys you. The footage shows me on the deck for 40 seconds. It shows Brell reading the contract slate aloud over me, performing it for the corridor, because that too was part of the lesson. Then the footage shows the corridor lights go to maintenance amber, and the pressure door at the far end cycle open on an override code, And the timestamp is the part the analyst kept freezing on, because the alarm on my position had existed for all of 51 seconds. There were no alarms in that corridor. There was no signal from me. The proceedings established that Marinosi, upon noticing that a 14-minute scrap run had reached minute 20, had pulled the corridor schedule, identified the only camera-shadowed route between the fab shops and her bench, and walked into it on a registrar's override, and that she had done all this inside 1 minute, with no apparent urgency, carrying nothing but her inspection tablet and a pressure seamer still warm from the bench. I want to be precise about what happened next, because this is the part the row still tells wrong, and the legend does the truth a disservice. The legend says she fought them. She did not fight them, not in any sense a Korish would dignify with the word. The footage shows 9 seconds of contact. A breaker foreman spends her working life around beings and machines vastly stronger than herself. The trade survives by knowing where load sits and what every joint can and cannot be asked to do. And Karash, she told the assessor later, in the flattest sentence of the entire deposition, are racked wrong. They carry their mass high. Their stabilizer joints lock under torsion. You do not need to be stronger than the load. You need to know where it wants to fall and step there first. 9 seconds. Akatsu's leading knee lock folded under his own committed weight and put him into the wall hard enough to crack 2 plates. Brell, turning, met the flat of her boot at the precise off-axis point of his planted ankle, went down across his partner, and found the working end of a pressure seamer resting, switched off, against the soft junction plate below his eye. The footage shows her saying something. There is no audio. Brell stated in his deposition that the words were, "Breathe slower. You'll panic the boy." Then she bound their wrist spurs with their own restraint cord, the same cord they had brought for me. In the same 2-point configuration, helped me up, checked my eyes with a hand lamp, picked up the scrap plate I had dropped, and handed half of it to me to carry because, and this is the sentence I think about most from that whole night, no sense wasting the trip. We walked back to the bench. She made tea. Her hands on the pot were the same hands as every other night. I sat on the stool with my whole body shaking, 16 turnings of refugee survival logic coming apart, because every rule I knew said what had just happened was impossible. Not the mechanics of it, but the arithmetic. Nobody spends what she had just spent on someone who is not blood. There is no return on it. The tithe's entire system, every tithe, every apprenticeship, every flattened frill on every counter on Spindle Row rested on that arithmetic, and an old woman had just walked through it like it was weather. "They'll come back," I finally managed. "They'll come back bigger." She poured the tea. "I know," she said, and there was nothing in her voice except, I swear to this, a kind of settled patience, the tone of a woman confirming a delivery schedule. "Drink that. Your line's been wandering left all week, and now I know your feet weren't the problem." The TIE's response meeting convened at the cargo dock office 11 hours later, and we know everything about it because Dolan Vey, a thorough administrator to the end, recorded his own meetings. The recording has since been entered into the Hegemony's permanent training archive, and I am told that junior assessors across 40 stations have now listened to a Korish Syndicate boss learn about human pack bonding in real time. It is regarded as a foundational document. On Berest Ring, we regard it differently. On the row, when someone refuses to hear a warning, we say they are holding the Vesh recording. Dolan Vey had hired a consultant. This was, the office's analysis agrees, the single intelligent decision of his tenure, and he made it for the wrong reason. He believed he had a personnel problem, 2 enforcers humiliated, a corridor lesson failed, deterrence leaking. He wanted the anomaly priced and corrected. The consultant he engaged was a Liam xenobehaviorist named Counselor Vesh, contract certified across the spur, a specialist in what the Liam call interaction risk. And the recording preserves the exact moment Vesh stopped being a consultant, taking a routine fee and became, in his own later words, a witness arriving at a structure fire. It is the moment Dolan Vey says the words retired human female. You can hear it on the recording. The Liam speak in chords, 2 vocal columns at once, and both of Vesh's columns stop. 4 full seconds of silence, expensive consultant silence, and then Vesh asks his first question. And it is not about the corridor, the enforcers, the seamer, or the override codes. He asks, "Who does she eat with?" Dolan Vey, audibly thrown, says the household staff had noted the Vreneth family, dinner pots, twice a week, also the boy at her bench daily, also the small one, fasteners, tomatoes. And Vesh says, in the tone of a structural engineer being shown a crack and asked if it matters, "Then you do not have a personnel problem. You have a bonded human. I need to see everything, and you need to stop all action against that family as of this hour." What follows on the recording is 40 minutes that the Office of Species Advisories has annotated line by line, because it is the clearest field example in the archive of a competent specialist explaining the trait to a hostile audience that has every commercial incentive to listen and failing. Vesh begins with the chemistry because the Leem respect mechanisms. Humans, he explains, run their social bonding on a chemical cascade, an oxytocin system, ancient, pre-sapient, originally for mating pairs and offspring. Nothing exotic. Half the species in the spur have an analog. The anomaly is the targeting. Every other species bonding system has boundaries, blood, clan, contract, hive, scent line, something that tells the cascade where to stop. The human system has no hard boundary. It will bond to non-kin. It will bond across species. It is documented bonding to animals, to ships, to crippled maintenance drones, to dead men's jackets, to patches of ground. The human does not decide to do this, Vesh is careful to say, twice, not the way Aleem decides to sign. The system fires on proximity, on shared meals, on small reciprocal labor, on, and you can hear him reading from the surveillance summary as he says it, the teaching of a craft to a juvenile. Dolan Vey interrupts there, on the recording, to say what every listener in every training room since has wanted him to not say. He says, sentiment, you're describing sentiment. Sentiment is leverage. The pause before Vesh answers is 2 seconds long and contains, I have come to believe, the entire fate of the tithe. With every species I am contracted to advise on, Vesh says, yes. Sentiment is where you apply pressure and the asset bends. I am telling you, as your risk counsel, that the human variant does not bend because it is not functionally sentiment. Functionally, it is identity. The literature stopped calling it attachment 40 years ago. The current term is incorporation. The bonded parties are processed, neurologically, as self. You are not asking how hard she will fight for the Vreneth family. That is the wrong question, and it is the question your entire model keeps asking. The correct question is how hard she would fight for her own body, and the answer to that question, with humans, is the reason their file carries the longest appendix in the registry. Dolan Vey, to his small credit, asks for the appendix. What Vesh summarizes next, the case material, I will set down as he gave it, because the row heard it all eventually, the way everything in those records leaked into legend. And because a listener who wants to understand what was sitting 2 doors from my mother's stall potting tomatoes needs the same education the tithe got and disregarded. Item, the Pell Convoy incident. A mixed-species ore convoy raided by harvest pirates in the Dren Shallows. The pirates took hostages from the crews to discourage pursuit. Standard practice, effective for a century, because every species pursuit calculus eventually balances loss against fleet cost and breaks off. One of the 6 ships was human-crewed. The pirates' own logs, recovered later, record their growing disbelief across 19 days as the human ship declined to balance anything, followed through 3 refuel stops they had never needed to defend before, declined ransom contact, declined a returned hostage as settlement, and was still accelerating when the pirates crossed into a hegemony interdiction zone to shed it, which is how they were caught, because the human ship had long since alerted the interdiction patrol and was not pursuing at all. It was hurting. The hostage in question, Vesh notes, was not human. It was a Selite cargo hand who had served on the human ship for 1 contract season and shared, the literature always returns to the same markers, a mess table. Item, the Ash Station siege, a habitat blockade, food contracting, during which human residents, 11% of the population, were documented systematically rationing themselves below medical minimums to feed neighbors, non-kin, other species neighbors, while concealing the fact and becoming, the report notes with what reads at this distance like exhausted wonder, measurably more dangerous to the blockading force as their own condition degraded, organizing the breach parties, taking the highest risk crawl space routes until the blockade commander reported to his board that the station's most depleted demographic was conducting its most effective resistance, and that he could not model an enemy whose combat output rose as its supply line failed. Item, the retrieval statistics, human military doctrine across recorded engagements, casualty acceptance in operations to recover bonded personnel, including personnel already dead, including, in 9 documented cases, the bodies of bonded non-humans, at rates that no other species doctrine permits for any objective whatsoever. Vesh reads the figure and then reads it again because Dolan V has asked him to repeat it, and the second reading is slower. Item, and on the recording Vesh's chords go very flat here, the way a voice goes when it moves from literature to memory. The Vayatham Combine, 2 spans back, which ran a protection ledger on a human-adjacent district very like Spindle Row, and which made the category error of holding a bonded individual as commercial collateral, and which does not now exist, not as an enterprise, not as a fleet, not as a registered name, and whose dissolution required no fleet action by anyone, because the human in question was a logistics auditor who spent 11 months taking the Combine apart through registry filings, cargo certifications, and dead instruments, and who was described in the final hegemony report by a phrase Vesh quotes verbatim and which has since followed the species. Through every risk seminar in the spur, the subject displayed no rage at any point. Investigators found only diligence. Stop all action against the family, Vesh says again at the end of it. Refund the stall's ledger. Transfer the two enforcers off station, because she has seen their faces and humans do not lose faces. And then Dolan Vey, and I am saying this as a line item, you should consider whether this deck is worth holding at all, because your organization has already done the one thing the appendix says cannot be undone. You have taught a bonded human to see your structure. She filed 11 code violations in her first week. Do you understand what that was? That was not a complaint. That was a survey. She is reading your load points. It is what they do. The bond does not make them angry, it makes them thorough, and an angry enemy is survivable. But I have read 40 years of this appendix, and I am telling you that nobody in it survives the thorough ones. Dolan V thanked him for the assessment. You can hear it on the recording, the administrative warmth, the sound of a fee being mentally disputed. Then he closed the file, kept the enforcers on station, restored the stall's tithe to the ledger at the compounded rate, and issued the directive that the proceedings would later mark as the hinge of the whole affair. If the anomaly was bonded to the family, then the family was no longer a revenue line. The family was leverage after all. Vesh had simply, in Dolan Vey's reading, identified where to apply it. Counselor Vesh resigned the contract by transmission that same night. The resignation notice is 4 words long, is now framed, I am told, in the Office of Species Advisory's Central Training Hall and reads, in full, I do not consult on outcomes I have already predicted. Dolan Vey did not go straight to the leverage. The record is clear on that, and fairness to the dead enterprise requires saying so. Between the consultant's warning and the writ, the tithe spent 20 days trying every instrument in the case short of force, and the 20 days matter because they are the period in which the trait stopped being one old woman's anomaly and became visibly something the whole row had contracted. The first instrument was the tag. Her registrar's inspection certification was the legal spine of everything she had done to them. The water filing, the flow shed violations, the corridor override, and the tithe owned enough of the deck bureaucracy to arrange a review of it. Grounds were manufactured. A complaint of inspection activity outside certified scope filed by a shell freight concern that existed, the proceedings established for 9 days, precisely long enough to file it. The review board convened upring, 3 certifying officers, 1 of them bought, 2 of them merely careful, and Marin appeared before it without an advocate, carrying her tag, her log, and 34 years of documentation in a yard canvas satchel. It took the board 40 minutes to discover what the tithe's analysts should have, that the satchel was the trap. Her inspection log was not merely clean. It was the cleanest instrument the senior officer had reviewed in his tenure. He said so on the record. Every entry sealed, cross-referenced, and procedurally immaculate, and the complaint against it obliged the board, under its own rules, to audit not the inspector but the inspections, which meant that 11 flow shed violations, a tampered flow regulator, an avoided pressure door contract moved that morning from a deck registrar's queue into a certifying board's official cognizance where no amount of dockside script could reach them. She had not fought the review. She had attended it punctually with everything they needed to ruin her employers, and let the machine do what machines do. The complaint was dismissed. The audit it triggered was not. The bought officer recused himself by the end of the week, citing health, and the office's annotation on the episode is one line, the subject's compliance is not submission, it is munitions. The second instrument was contraband. Someone in the dock office, the proceedings never established who, because Dolan Vey's recorder was for once not running, decided that if the human standing rested on her perfect paper, the answer was to dirty it, and a quarter brick of unlicensed accelerant from the tithe's own seized goods locker went into a wall void in her corridor frontage during third shift, with an anonymous hazard complaint to follow. The flaw in the plan was the wall. She had certified that frontage herself when she took the work permit, panel by panel as her logs showed 11 days earlier, and a breaker foreman, walking past her own bench, reads her own wall the way you read a crewmate's face. The proceedings record that the hazard complaint was filed at shift start. It records that her counterfiling, documenting the void, the brick, the tool marks on the panel fasteners, and because the tithe's locker clerks were lazy in the way she had taught me all corner cutters are lazy, the seized goods inventory tag still adhered to the brick's underside, had been logged the previous evening, 9 hours before the complaint, with the deck registrar and the certifying board both copied. She had found it, photographed it, filed it, and left it in the wall, and then she had gone to bed and let the tithe walk its own complaint into a pre-built record, proving the tithe had planted its own inventory in a certified inspector's wall. Filing number 33 of 41. The annotators flag the 9 hours of sleep specifically. Threat assessment, they note, must account for a species that finishes the countermeasure and then rests. The third instrument was attrition from within, and it was not an instrument at all, which is why it does not appear in the manual, only in the personnel files. Brell, the corridor enforcer, drew dock duty after his plates healed and began, the rosters show, trading shifts to avoid the row. Okatsu put in for transfer with language borrowed unmistakably from Gathi's denied request. 2 collectors resigned outright in the same span, one of them forfeiting a vesting bond to do it, which Korosh do not do, and the exit interview the tithe conducted survives and reads less like an interview than like a man describing a haunting. She waves, the collector said. We rate her the deck's primary threat, and she knows my name and asks after my molt, and I cannot make my route pass her bench anymore. You do not understand what it does to the work. The work runs on being the biggest thing in the corridor. Nothing on that deck believes we are the biggest thing in the corridor now. They look at us and you can see them thinking about her, and the worst of it is she has never once threatened anyone. There is nothing to report. You cannot file a grievance against the way 4,000 beings have stopped flinching. I watched that span from inside it, from the second stool, and what I remember is not the filings, which I knew nothing of, but the table. The communal table on our ark had seated the same 11 families my whole residence, fear having fixed the seating the way gravity fixes orbits, and that span it grew. Sen's people came, then the carriers who had been too full for my mother's produce and were ashamed of it. Then on one shift nobody planned, 2 dockgate families whose sons had been apprenticed years before and who had stopped coming to tables at all. My mother fed them without comment. Marin sat where she always sat, end seat nearest the door, an old habit she never explained and never had to, and argued with Hennek about scrubber tolerances, and was, to anyone without instruments, one more pensioner on a poor deck being loud about broth. The office's reconstruction gives that table a full page. Social load redistribution, the annotators call it, observed in all 41 incident reports, and modeled in none of them because the literature kept treating the bonded human as the threat vector, and the table is where the truth sits. The human is the seed crystal. The deck did not get safer because she was dangerous. The deck got dangerous, gently, structurally, the way ice is dangerous, because 4,000 beings reorganized themselves around the demonstrated fact that holding works. The tide's last instrument was aimed at one widow. By the time they used it, there was no version of the deck in which she stood alone, and they were the only ones aboard who did not know it. Miru asked her once, that span, at the bench, with a 6-turning child's aim for the exact center of a thing. The row had started its whispering by then, the legend already growing teeth, and my sister looked up from the fastener tray and asked her plainly whether she was a soldier before, like the stories said. No, Marin said, running a bead, not looking up. Soldiers break things for strangers. I only ever broke things for a living. She lifted the seamer, checked the line, and set Miru's next sorting cup in front of her. Everything I do for you people, I do retail. I did not laugh then, because I was 17 and trying to be solemn about my line. But I laughed later that night and could not entirely stop, and my mother came and stood in the doorway, and I told her, and she did not laugh. She looked down the corridor toward the lit frontage, where the old woman was watering tomatoes alone under violet glass, and she said, in the voice she used for the scald when she spoke of it at all, Essek, do you know what it cost her world, learning to be like that? Whole histories. You and I are guests at the end of a very long story. Then she went in and sent the dinner pot down twice that week instead of once, which was, on our deck, in our grammar, the loudest sentence she knew how to say. 20 days. Then the writ and the clerk with the bought seal, and my mother walking out between 4 enforcers with her back straight, and an old woman taking down her harness while the kettle cooled. And I have wondered since, reading the reconstruction with its timelines and annotations, whether anything could have turned the tithe off its path in that final span, and the office's conclusion is the bleakest sentence in the file, and I have come to believe it. No, the conclusion reads, by the 20th day every instrument had failed and been converted into evidence, and the organization faced a choice between writing off the deck and testing the bond directly, and enterprises do not write off decks. It is not in their nature, any more than the alternative was ever, for one instant, in hers. Before the leverage came the purchase attempt, because Dolan Vey was an administrator before he was anything else, and administrators try the cheap instrument first. He came to the row himself, which had not happened in living memory, with one aide and no visible enforcers, and he found Marin at the communal garden allotment she had badgered out of the deck registrar that winter, on her knees in the borrowed soil, planting out her seedlings with Miru handing her cups. I was there. Half the row was there. The garden had become a place people came whether or not they gardened. Dolan Vey introduced himself as though his name were not already a kind of weather on deck 9 and made his offer, and the offer was, the row agreed afterward, genuinely generous, because the cheap instrument only works if it is genuinely generous. Relocation to the upper arcs. A workshop berth with a yard-grade power feed. Her ledger zeroed in perpetuity, and he was a thorough man. The Tarn family's ledger zeroed with it. The stall's tithe forgiven, the apprenticeship contract destroyed, every grievance addressed, every line item satisfied. In exchange for nothing but distance, she would simply live somewhere better, and the row would return to being the row. Marin listened to the whole of it without standing up, which Dolan Vey, to his credit, took without visible offense. Then she asked her one question. And in the spring, she said, when the boy's seam work is good enough to certify, who signs his journeyman card on your arc? Dolan Vey said, reasonably that certified trades were not the tithes line of business. They're mine, she said, and went back to planting. That is the whole of the exchange that the Rose legend preserves, and for once the legend has it word for word. What the legend misses is what I saw because I was close enough, that her hands never stopped moving through any of it. Seedling, trowel, firm the soil, next cup, and that Dolan Vey watched her hands the entire time the way Gath had watched her in the stall, with the look of a creature whose instruments are returning a value they have no column for. He had come to buy a position and found there was no position. There was just an old woman who had decided, in some chamber of the human heart that no model in the spur has ever successfully priced, that a Vreneth boy would get his journeyman card with her name on the sponsor line, and that everything else, syndicates, ledgers, the architecture of fear on 3 decks of Barest Ring, was simply terrain between her and that signature. He offered more. She thanked him and asked Miru for the next cup. He mentioned delicately the compounding ledger. She recommended he have his flowshed recertified before the spring audit. He left, and the surveillance summary entered into the proceedings records that he spoke to no one for the rest of the shift. And I believe it, because I watched his face as he turned away, and it was the first time in my life I ever saw a Koresh look small. 8 days later they took my mother. I will set this down plainly, because it deserves plainness. They did it lawfully, or in the costume of lawfully. A debt custody writ under the tithes commercial articles, served at the stall at mid-shift by 4 enforcers with a registrar's clerk in tow, whose presence had been bought to give the thing a seal. Custodial guarantee against arrears, the writ said. The guarantor would reside at the dockside holding office until the compounded ledger was settled, or a service contract executed in consideration. The service contract was mine, pre-drafted the same apprenticeship slate with a new date. They had concluded, the seized communications confirm, that the human's bond ran through the family, and that the family's softest load-bearing point was the mother, and that the human, whatever the consultant's appendix said, would not act against a lawful writ with the row watching and a clerk's seal on the documents. The communications use the phrase contained by procedure. The Office of Species Advisory's annotation beside that phrase consists of one word, no. They served the writ, and Miru screamed, and my mother, whose frills had stopped flattening for the tithe 60 days before and never resumed, kissed my sister, told me to mind the pots, and walked out between the enforcers with her back straight, because she had learned things that winter about how one carries oneself in front of a child, and she had learned them from 2 doors down. I ran for the bench. Of course I did. I had rehearsed terrible news all my life. The Scald teaches its survivors that much, and I came through her door with the whole thing spilling out of me. The writ, the clerk, the doc, the contract, and Marin listened the way she listened to a seam description. And this is the part that I did not understand then and have spent the years since learning to describe, so I will describe it carefully now. Nothing about her sped up. She asked me 3 questions. Was Saya hurt? Did they take Maru too? Did I sign anything? No, she nodded. Then she took the kettle off, because it had been on, and poured 2 teas and set one in front of me, and told me to drink it slowly and then go home, bolt the stall, and keep my sister with the Hennecks until morning, and that my mother would be home before the pots needed minding, and she said all of it in the voice she used for telling me my feet were wrong, the absolutely level voice of a woman relaying settled facts, and the terrible thing, the thing that finally let me see what Vesh had been trying to make Dolan Vey see, is that I believed her instantly and completely, the way you believe a load rating stamped on a beam. Then she went to the wall rack and began taking down her yard rig, the mag boots, the old foreman's harness with the tool loops, gone shiny at the corners, the inspection tablet, and the look on her face as she did it was not rage. I have been asked by 3 separate assessors whether it was rage, and it was not. It was the look she had at the bench at the start of a long shift, a kind of settling, a woman picking up the day's work. and she saw me still standing there with my tea, and she said the sentence that the proceedings would later spend 2 full sessions on, because the corridor pickup outside her door caught it, and the analysts could not at first accept that it was generated before the events at the dock rather than after. They priced the boy, she said, fitting the tablet into its loop. They priced the stall and the water and your mother. 60 days of pricing. She sealed the harness with one pull. They never once priced me. What the row did that night is not in the hegemony's reconstruction, because the reconstruction follows her, and the row is a footnote in it. Ambient population, no operational role. The row remembers otherwise. I took Miru to the Hennex as I was told and bolted the stall as I was told, and then I stood in our doorway and watched Spindle Row decide, in the space of half a shift, what it had become. The word moved down the corridor faster than I could have run it. They took Sayatarn. By the time Marin's hatch opened, there were beings at the corridor mouth and not watchers. Hennex stood at the front of them with a deck pry bar held down along his leg, 60 turnings old, a scrubber repairman who had spent 4 decades perfecting the art of not being noticed, and behind him Sen and his sons and the carriers, and Telek's father with his dock hooks, and more arriving as I watched, 15, 20, the population of 3 communal tables standing in the amber evening light with tools in their hands and nobody speaking, because nobody knew the words for what they were volunteering to do. There was no plan. There was no leader. There was just a deck full of beings who had spent 40 years learning to flatten their frills, standing in a corridor holding pry bars, having apparently collectively, without one meeting, decided to stop. The annotators would have a name for it, I am sure. Secondary bond propagation, or load redistribution terminal phase. I was there, and I will give it its right name. It was the row paying its tithe. The real one, the one she had been collecting all winter without ever naming it, in dinner pots and fixed manifolds and welding lessons, and it had compounded the way her kind of ledger compounds, and that night it came due all at once. And 20 beings stood at a corridor mouth ready to walk into a syndicate dock behind a 61-turning widow, and I believe to this day that if she had asked for them, everyone would have gone, and some would not have come back. She came up the corridor in her yard rig at her ordinary pace, and stopped and looked at them. The row still argues about her face in that moment. Hennex swears she was angry, the only time anyone on the deck claims to have seen it. Sen says, not angry, frightened, the only time for that too, and that the fright was not of the tithe. I was 20 meters back, and I will not pretend to have read her face, but I heard her voice, because the corridor was silent as a sealed hold, and the voice was the bench voice, flat as a finished seam, and what she said is not in any official record and is carved now into the lintel of the trade school in Vreneth script by a hand I know because the hand was mine. This is inspection work, she said. Inspectors go alone. Henneck did not move. He stood holding his pry bar. This gentle being who had walked me to her door on the first morning, patting my shoulder like a man sending a boy to sea, and he answered her in front of 20 witnesses with his frills standing fully erect, which among Vreneth is the posture you take at gravesides and weddings and nowhere else. You have been alone the whole winter, he said. We let you be. We are ashamed enough. The pause that followed is, in the rose telling, an hour long. It cannot have been 4 seconds. Then Marinosi did something she had done for no syndicate instrument all winter. No collector, no review board, no quarter brick in a wall. She gave ground. 1 step sideways, so she was no longer facing Henneck through the crowd but standing among them, and when she spoke again, the flat had gone out of the voice, just slightly, just once, like a seam relaxing as it cools. Then walk me to the gate, she said. Wait outside it. If I'm longer than an hour, don't come in after me. She settled the harness on her shoulders. Go wake the magistrate's clerk on deck 4 instead. Tell her filing 34 has gone active. She'll know what it means. That's the only rescue I'll ever need, and I need it sworn. And then, because 20 beings worth of held breath had to go somewhere, she looked around at the pry bars and the dock hooks and added in the bench voice, and put those back where they're racked. You're insulating, not arming. Honestly, this deck. The laugh that went down the corridor had blood in it. The kind of laugh that is the body standing down from something it was fully prepared to do. They walked her to the gate, all 20, in a loose silent column through the freight corridor, the strangest procession in the ring's history, an old human in a breaker's harness walking to a syndicate dock inside an honor guard of repairmen, and at the gate they stopped to a being on the public side of the line and stood there for 54 minutes, and the dock cameras caught all of it. And the office did eventually annotate that footage, 1 line the driest in the file, and for once I think the dryness is awe. At no point did the subject's auxiliary force require instruction. It's self-organized, self-limited, and self-positioned as witnesses rather than combatants, converting a potential riot into a legal observation party. Note for the appendix. The bond once propagated appears to confer the subject's methods, not merely her motive. My mother's hour inside is hers to tell, and she has told it rarely and always the same way, with long stillnesses in it. The holding room was clean and cold. The bought clerk would not meet her eyes and resealed the writ twice, the way you check a tool you have begun to suspect. Through the wall she could hear the dock office's comm board, and she is Vreneth. Our hearing runs under everyone's assumptions, and so she became, without their knowing, the only living witness to the tithe's final muster, the sound of an organization discovering what it weighed. Dolanvy's voice, calm at first, putting out the call to the reserve roster as the gate cameras showed the procession coming up the freight corridor. 20 enforcers on the books for dock defense. She heard the board work down the list name by name, and she heard what came back, and what came back, my mother says, was the quietest sound she has ever heard a syndicate make. Not answering, line after line, name after name, enforcers seeing the origin code on their handsets and letting them ring, men with vesting bonds and clan deps and every reason the manual recognizes, declining one by one in the oldest language there is, to stand between a bonded human and her family. By the time the gate enforcers called in the 9-second report, the reserve roster had returned 4 beings out of 20, and 2 of those were the pair already lying bound on the apron. She heard Dolanve set down the handset. She heard through a bulkhead in the silence of a comm board nobody was answering. The precise moment the largest organization on 3 decks understood that it consisted, operationally, of 1 administrator, 1 bought clerk, and a building whose doors were legally hers. And then she heard the outer hatch cycle, unhurried, and a voice she knew from a winter of dinner pots say, mildly to the room, "Evening. I'm here about a custody writ. And while I've got you, your gate's out of certification. Squeals on the second hinge. Have your boy oil it before the auction." I did not follow her. She had told me to go home, and you did what Marinosi told you, that winter most of all. So what happened at the cargo dock between the start of 4th shift and the moment my mother walked back through our hatch, unhurt, carrying her own custody writ folded into a square like a finished receipt, I know the way the rest of the spur knows it. From the footage, the depositions, and the seized records, all of it assembled in the proceedings and the office's incident reconstruction, which runs to 400 pages, and which I have read more times than is likely good for me. So, the reconstruction. She walked the freight corridor in plain view of every camera, at her ordinary pace, the row's silent column behind her as far as the gate line and not 1 step past it. The office's annotators flagged the pace. An aggrieved party storms, the annotation says, a frightened party hesitates. The subject's gait is consistent throughout with a trades worker reporting for shift, and this, the annotator's note, is itself a threat indicator in bonded humans, possibly the threat indicator, and was read by no one on site. At the dock gate, where her escort halted on the public side of the line, 2 enforcers stopped her. The footage shows 9 seconds of contact. I will not describe them again. They are the same 9 seconds as the corridor, almost to the frame. The same folded knee lock, the same off-axis ankle, the same 2 beings on the deck bound in their own cord, and the annotation here says only, see prior incident. The subject repeats solutions that work, and the repetition itself appears to be deliberate. See section on demonstration behavior in bonded humans. Then she walked into Dolanve's office, sat down across from him without invitation, set her inspection tablet on his desk, with the screen facing him, and for the next 11 minutes, in the same flat voice she used for SEAM reports, conducted what the Hegemony's incident report formally describes as a structural briefing. Because here is what she had been doing for 60 days. Not enduring, surveying. The 11 code violations in the flow shed had been the first pass. Every inspection her registrar's tag entitled her to, she had made, and a breaker foreman's tag, kept scrupulously current for 30 years, entitles her to a great deal. She had walked at the Tide's dockside properties as a compliance inspector, legally logged and sealed, while their enforcers smirked at the old woman with the tablet. She had certified their cargo seals, which is how she came to hold the rotation schedules of every cache they thought was dark. She had filed recertification queries on their skiff fleet, which is how their drive signatures came to sit in a Hegemony registry queue, flagged, pending, 1 transmission from a customs hold. She had cross-referenced their holding office's pressure door maintenance contract, found it void for cause, and filed the voidance, which is how it came to be that on the night they took her neighbor as collateral, every door in their own building stood legally condemned, overridable by any current tag inspector on the deck, and the only current tag inspector on the deck was sitting across the desk from Dolanve, sliding her tablet toward him, showing him his own organization, rendered as what it had been to her since the day Gathy pinned a contract to a broth. Stall counter, a decommissioned structure, surveyed, tagged, and scheduled for breaking. 41 filings. That was the number the proceedings established. 41 separate regulatory instruments prepared across 60 days, each one individually minor, each one filed quietly into queues whose processing lag she had calculated. Because a foreman schedules every cut so the stack falls inward, and all 41 were timed to come due within the same 6-day window, and the window had opened that morning, before the writ. The annotators flagged this hard. The demolition sequence predated the hostage-taking. She had not built it in answer to the worst thing they did. She had built it in answer to the first thing they did, and then waited, husbanding it, hoping. Her own deposition says in the only line where the assessors pressed her on intent that it could rot in the queue unused. You file the condemnation, and you still hope the building has the sense to stand empty. The custody writ took her 4 minutes to dispose of. The bought clerk's seal, it turned out, belonged to a registrar whose certification she had already had cause to examine during the water affair, and whose seal log discrepancies were filing number 26 of 41. The writ was not merely void. It was, with the filing now live, evidence. She explained this to Dolan Vey the way she explained things to me at the bench, patiently, once, with the underlying loads exposed, and the audio from his own meeting recorder, still dutifully running, preserves the silence with which 300 kilos of Syndicate boss absorbed the news that the piece of paper holding a Vreneth woman in his back room had converted, while he watched, into the instrument of his own indictment. Then she said, the part that the spur knows by heart now, the part that travels, the lines that turned up stenciled, inside cargo hulls and over barracks doors within a year, words from an old woman's deposition, doing what no fleet demonstration in my lifetime had managed. Here's the state of it, she said. Everything you own on this ring is 1 transmissions from seizure, and the transmission is queued, and the queue is not mine to stop anymore. That part's just arithmetic now. The part that's still mine is Syatarn, and I'll say this once, so listen with your whole body. I came here tonight as an inspector. Whether I leave as one depends entirely on whether she walks out that door ahead of me. I've been gentle, because she'd want me gentle. But you should understand you've taken collateral. So have I, 60 days of it. The difference between us is I know exactly what mine is worth, and you have no idea what yours is. Because you people have never once managed to price me, and you have 1 door left between you and never having to. The reconstruction notes that Dolan Vey looked at the 2 enforcers, visible through his office glass, still bound on the dock apron in their own cord, and then at the tablet, and then made the only fully rational decision of his tenure. My mother walked out ahead of her. The footage shows it. Syatarn stepping over a bound Korish with her back straight, and the old human falling in behind her between her and the building, where she stayed for the whole walk home. And anyone who wants to understand the trait, the assessors are told, should study that frame, not the 9-second clips. The human positioned, even then, even one, between the bonded and the load. The 41 filings came due across the following 6 days, and the tithe on Barrist Ring came apart the way a yard ship comes apart, which is to say not dramatically, in sequence, cut by scheduled cut. Catches sealed under customs hold. The skiff fleet flagged and grounded. The holding office actually condemned, enforcers carrying furniture out under the eyes of deck inspectors. The bought registrar suspended, and with him every writ he had ever sealed, which unraveled ledgers on 3 decks and turned 400 apprenticeship contracts into evidence. Dolan Vey himself was aboard the 2nd outbound freighter, and the seized communications show why. The remnant of his board, off-station, had reviewed the Vesh recording at last, far too late, and issued a directive that consisted of the consultant's own forward resignation, return to sender, followed by a fleet-wide species advisory of their own that simply read, no engagements on rings where bonded humans are resident, and no audits of how many rings that is. There was one more attempt. It belongs in the record because of how it ended. A faction of the remnant board, unwilling to write off 3 decks, engaged an independent contractor through the Pale Ledger Guild, a professional named Ferric Dahl, half a span's reputation, never an incomplete contract. Dahl did what professionals do and researched the target before accepting, and the Guild's channel intercepts entered into the proceedings under seal and leaked within a month because everything in this affair leaked. Preserve his declination notice to the board in full. It is studied now alongside the Vesh recording, and it is shorter. I've read the file you sent and the file you didn't, it says. The fee is for a retired dock worker. The target is a human who has had 60 days to learn your employer's structure, and now has nothing left to protect on-site, because she's already won, which means any move on her manufactures the one thing the literature says you do not manufacture. A bonded human with a grievance and free time. The Veyathim paid 4 times this fee. Find me an executor among them and I'll match their price. Declined with prejudice and a professional courtesy, gratis. Stop writing her species name in the threat column. It goes the spring between the collapse and the assessor's arrival is the part the official record thins out, because the official record follows the threat, and the threat was gone. But I was 18 and present, and what happened on Barrist Ring in those months belongs in any honest account of the trait. Because the file calls what she did deterrence, and deterrence was the smallest part of it. The apprenticeship contracts came home first. 400 of them, voided in a block when the bought registrar's seal fell, and with them 400 sons and daughters of 3 decks, released from the dock gates and the cargo runs and the rooms where the cargo turned into the other thing, and the row found out that getting them back was not an ending but a trade. They came back with new boots and old eyes, as I said, and the eyes did not reset when the paperwork did. The communal tables took them in, and the tables did not always know how. There were bad nights that spring. There was a Vreneth boy 2 arcs down, Telic, 3 years apprenticed, who could not sit with his back to a door, and who broke a carrier's jaw over a misheard word in the second span, and the old row would have shunned him quietly into the downring dark, because the old row could not afford damaged things. Marin put a seamer in his hands. She never made a doctrine of it. That is the thing the legend gets wrong by making her wise. She would have spat at the word. She did what yards do with bent stock, which is fine the load it can still carry, and her corridor bench grew a 3rd stool, and then a 5th, and by high spring the registrar had, with the day's compliance that office now showed her in all things, chartered the frontage as a trade school, the first on the deck's books in its history. Barris Polytechnic, the charter says, which everyone understood was the registrar reaching for dignity. The row has only ever called it the bench. Telic certified 2 years behind me. He teaches there now. His back is to the door all shift, I have seen it, and I asked him once how, and he said the thing that I would put on her stone if Vreneth raised stones. Same way as anybody. I know what's between the door and me. The freighter crews started coming in that same span. Because the story had gone out the way stories go out, in cargo manifests and dock gossip and the pale ledger leak, growing wrong as it traveled. Up spur they were telling it with a massacre in it. 200 enforcers, 1 human, a docking bay painted with the consequences. I have heard 4 versions sung and not one contains a regulatory filing, because songs need blood, and the truth's blood was all on paper. And crews on the Burris run would walk down to Spindle Row between loadings to see where it happened. The way beings visit battlefields. And what they found was a corridor full of tomato planters, and an old woman teaching a Koros child to true a seam, and you could watch it hit them, one crew after another, the recalibration the whole spur was undergoing in miniature. Looking at the small gray retired thing with the crooked fingers, checking it against the song, and arriving, visibly fearfully, at the understanding that the song had it backwards. The song made her safe to believe in by making her a warrior. The bench made her true, and the truth was worse. There was no warrior. There was a neighbor with a tag and a temper she had never once needed to raise, and there were a million more like her, retail, everywhere their species settled, indistinguishable from pensioners right up until you pinned a contract to the wrong counter. One crew chief, a Sullite, stood at the planters for a long time that summer, and finally asked her, with the bluntness of a being who had clearly crossed half the spur to ask it, whether it was true, what their risk officer now briefed, that any human anywhere might be one of her kind, bonded and primed with no way to test for it. She did not stop watering. "Mister," she said, "I'll tell you what I told the hegemony. You're asking if it's rare." She moved down the row, the can ticking as it emptied. "It's not rare. It's just quiet. Most of us go the whole way out without anyone ever taking what's ours, so nobody ever sees the bill. You're not asking whether the bond's there. It's there. You're asking whether you'll ever owe on it." She straightened up and looked at him, and I watched a being who hauled ore through pirate shallows for a living step back from a gardener. Don't take what's ours, and it never comes due. Cheap as insurance in the spur. He bought a tomato, he insisted. It is, by reliable account, framed in a Sullite wardroom 400 lights from here, under a label that translates approximately as policy document. And she was embarrassed. That is the last thing the spring record needs, because the file does not hold it, and the songs cannot. The attention sat on her like a wrong-size coat the entire season. She deflected the freighter crews to the bench's donation ledger, the registrar's honors to my mother's shopfront license, the row's first attempt at a feast day in her name into a feast day for the returned apprentices, flatly refusing, in committee with prejudice, to attend anything held in her honor, until the row outmaneuvered her by holding it with no honoree at all, just a long table down the whole corridor on charter day, and she came to that and sat at the end seat nearest the door and complained about the late tomatoes, and was, for one evening, surrounded by every life she had quietly refused to let the tithe subtract, simply one more resident of the deck she had rebuilt by hand. I sat across from her that night, journeyman card 3 weeks old in my pocket, and I had drunk just enough fermented weed stock to finally ask what the boy in me had been carrying since the broth stall. Why us, I asked her. That first day, fourth in a deadline, 1 coin extra. You didn't know us. Why did you stand there? She was quiet long enough that I thought the question had been a trespass. Down the table, Miru was teaching a returned apprentice her fastener game. My mother was refilling Henek's bowl against his protests. The corridor lights were banked to evening amber, and the whole long, human-built warmth of it hummed around us, and Marin turned her cup with her crooked fingers and answered me with the only piece of her own file she ever volunteered. Dan and I never managed kids, she said. Yards took those years. Then he got the rot, and the rot's slow, and you sit in a cube 2 doors off a broth stall doing the arithmetic of what's left, and you can go 2 ways. You can guard it. She turned the cup. Or you can spend it like there's more. Humans are bad at guarding. Costs us time to time. Cost everyone else more time to time. Your tithe found that out. She looked down the table then, at all of it, at the noise, and her voice never moved off its one flat register. But I was her apprentice, and I knew her hands, and her hands had gone still. Nobody stands in a dead line for strangers, Essek. There's no such animal. I stood there because I'd already eaten your mother's broth 2 winters, and watched you carry your sister on your back through the pressure cold like it was nothing, like it was just what was yours to carry. You were never strangers. That's the part you people in the hegemony both keep getting wrong about us. She finished the cup and set it down. There's no moment we decide you're family. There's just the moment we find out you didn't know. The hegemony assessor came in the spring when the proceedings were winding down and the row had already begun repainting the dockside arc, and her arrival is where my account stops being memory and starts being transcript, because Assessor Kwam Etta of the Office of Species Advisors recorded everything and gave me leave years later to quote what I needed. She interviewed 40 of us, the Heneks, the registrar, Gathy, who had finally gotten his transfer and gave his deposition by relay, and whose testimony, the one collector who had read it right from the first week, runs through the final advisory like a load path. She interviewed my mother, who served her broth and answered every question and then asked one back, which was whether the hegemony intended to take Marin away, and did not relax until the assessor said no, and that exchange is in the record too. Flagged by some annotator with the dry note. Bonding observed to be bidirectional. The family has incorporated the human. See appendix on reciprocal effects. She interviewed me for 2 days. At the end of the second day, she set down her stylus and asked the question I could tell she had carried in through the door, the unofficial one. You were the proximate cause, she said. The contract pinned to the counter. 60 days later, a syndicate that had operated for 40 years was gone. As the proximate cause, what do you believe we should write in the advisory? I was 18 by then, and I had thought about almost nothing else, so I had an answer. Write that they never saw a weapon, I said, because there wasn't one. Write that everything she did was a door any of us could have walked through. The tags, the filings, the inspections, and none of us did, because none of us could afford to be noticed, and she could because she'd decided we were hers, and a human spending itself on its own doesn't count costs. You keep asking me when she became dangerous. You're asking it wrong. She was dangerous the whole time, the way the reactor's dangerous, the way the hull's dangerous. The only thing that changed in that stall is what she was dangerous for. Kwam Etta wrote for a long moment. Then she said quietly, not for the recorder, though the recorder caught it. Every incident report in the appendix says some version of that sentence. 41 reports. We keep hoping one of them won't. The interview with Marin herself took place at the bench, because she declined to come to the hearing room on the grounds that she had a journeyman, candidate 3 weeks from certification, and the hegemony, in the person of its assessor, came to her and sat on my stool, and I ran seams in the corner while the Spurs' formal machinery tried to get the trait to describe itself. It could not, of course. That transcript is famous now for how little is in it. Asked about the corridor, they were hurting a boy I teach. Asked about the 9 seconds, the folded korosh, where a retired forewoman learned it. 30 years of not getting killed by things bigger than me, same as anyone. Asked about the 41 filings, the 60 days, the patience. You inspect what's next to your family, anyone would. And the assessor leaned in on that one, because it was the heart of the file, and said with great care, Miss Osi, I have served this office for 30 years, and I must tell you for the record, anyone would not. That is the finding. In all the spur, across every species we advise on, anyone would not. Only your kind does this, and your kind does it everywhere, and every time, and for anyone, and you may be the only species in the registry that finds that unremarkable. The recorder caught 11 seconds of silence, the bench fans, my seamer ticking as it cooled. Then Marin said the only thing in the whole proceeding that I ever heard her say about her own species, the thing I have turned over every day since. You keep the file, she said. We'll keep each other. See which one of us still holds in 100 years. Species Advisory 7741K was published the following year, spur-wide, mandatory inclusion in all commercial risk curricula, and it is short, as the binding ones are. It defines the bond. It defines the visibility gap. It instructs, in clauses that lawyers have since gone gray on, that human social attachments be treated as undetectable, unbounded, and non-negotiable, and that no enterprise model treat any human as an individual actor. Because the operative clause says, the registry contains no confirmed instance of one, and it closes with the paragraph that gets stenciled, the one the office fought its own editors to keep, because plain language, the drafters argued, was the only language the 41 report suggested anyone remembered. Do not ask how many guard a human's family. The answer is the human. The whole human applied without remainder for as long as the human lasts, and they last. Do not ask what the human's family is. You cannot detect it, you cannot bound it, and you may already be in it or in its way. The bond is not the human's weakness. It is the load-bearing structure of the most dangerous species in the registry. And like all load-bearing structure, it is invisible until you cut it, and then it is the last thing you learn. That is the official ending, the one the spur knows. Barest Ring keeps its own. Marinosi is 83 now. She still lives 2 doors from the stall, which is a real shopfront these days, with my mother's name over it and Miru's books in the back. The garden allotment runs the length of the arc, because the deck registrar long ago stopped pretending he could refuse her anything. And on 4th shift evenings, half the row's children are in it, learning what soil is from a woman who broke warships for 34 years and worries aloud in her one flat register that the tomatoes are coming in late. My journeyman card hangs over my own bench now, on the upper arc, her name on the sponsor line. I teach 2 apprentices, a Vreneth girl and a young Kurush, which is its own story, and I catch myself watching my door the way she watched hers, and I understand at last that the file and the advisory and the stencil clauses all circle one small fact they can never quite hold, the fact I was given at 16 with a tin of broth and a corrected grip. The Galaxy read 60 days of filings and called it the most patient demolition in the registry. The row watched the same 60 days and called it an old woman keeping her family fed. Both are true, and the second one is the warning, and this is the last thing I will set down, Assessor, so write it whole. The most feared act in the spur, the one with the longest appendix, the one the syndicates and the contractors and the war colleges cannot price, began as a human standing in a deadline in a poor stall, deciding we were worth a coin extra. They never priced her because she cannot be priced. She can only be loved back and held on to, and that is what we did, and that, the file says, in its dry 41 report language, makes us the safest family in the spur. She says it shorter. She says, set another bowl.